We say that this work, given the anticipated rise in poverty as a result of COVID, which is expected to be the highest poverty numbers, at least in the short term, that we've seen in 50 years, that this work is more relevant, urgent, and as important as ever. So your feedback is critically important as the state seeks to recover. So with that, I am just going to jump into a little bit of the history. Governor Inslee issued a directive to create the Poverty Reduction Workgroup in November 2017. And he did that after learning that more than 500,000 children in Washington state live in families that struggle to make ends meet, which is unacceptable anywhere, but especially in a state with so much prosperity. That number is much higher now. We don't have official poverty numbers in response to the pandemic. It's a little too soon for that. But our initial estimates show that poverty has just absolutely skyrocketed, as has food insecurity, especially among children. Obviously, everyone has heard about unemployment. So again, the work that we're presenting to you was done pre-COVID, but certainly the urgency has grown. The governor is well aware of that. Governor Inslee's economic recovery framework for the state includes poverty reduction as a key pillar of the plan. And so this plan is very, very much active right now in the economic recovery conversation. So why is this work important? There's probably no more robust finding in the literature on the effects of poverty on the well-being of children, families, adults, and communities. If you look at any indicator that's listed here, and there are others, these are just examples, there is an incredibly strong evidence base that poverty, if we were to reduce poverty and inequality, all of these indicators would improve. So well-being across the board would improve if we, supported people in meeting their most foundational needs and providing them the building blocks to success. The well-being argument should be the main reason why we do this work, but it's also notable that when you invest in the economic security of children, adults, and families and communities, you see an enormous return on investment. If you just look at child poverty, for every dollar invested in reducing child poverty, there's a $7 return to the economy. And that's because we spend less on issues like homelessness, behavioral health issues, involvement in the juvenile and criminal justice systems. And also this number factors in the higher earnings that those children are likely to earn as adults because they're more likely to attend higher education and they're more likely to land in jobs that pay a living wage. So, from both a, social well-being side and an economic argument side, this makes a ton of sense. So, Governor Inslee, in his directive, had a number of factors that he wanted addressed in bringing a group together. There was some parameters for who was invited to this group, and it was quite a diverse group. We really tried to be as inclusive and make it, as representative as we could within those parameters. And so agencies were involved, 10 different agencies at the state racial and ethnic commissions were involved. We had a large representation from community organizations and tribal and urban Indians, the employer community, advocacy community, think tanks, and a couple funders were involved. Legislators were on the task force. And early on, those groups came together and decided unanimously, really, that two things were incredibly important in this work if we were going to be successful. One was a focus, on racial equity and equity across the board, but, beginning with racial equity because it's really foundational to poverty in so many ways. And the other thing that was really important was to elevate the influence and expertise of people experiencing poverty in this process, and having them not only, be alongside us in this work, but really have the power over the priorities that this group um, undertook and what we were to look at in developing a plan. And they also got final approval over the plan. And so a steering committee was created, and Sharice and Drayton were on that steering committee. And before I turn it over to them to talk about, the role that the steering committee played, I just want to emphasize just how critical they were to this effort. Um, you know, uh, Having the group really listen and learn from them as experts in their own lives, who, we know in government, we know the systems that we're a part of, but the steering committee members, who many of who are using our systems, they know them, uh, better than us from a global standpoint, because they're using all of them, and they know the cracks because they're falling through them. And so they are absolutely the best people to be listening to on how to improve the way that we serve people at the state. And they're also just, they're advocates and experts in their own right. They, the process that was in place to pull the recommendations together, I can say definitively that we would not have come up with such a strong plan had we not had them guiding us in this work. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dre and Charisse to talk about their experience in this process and what it meant to them. So,
Thank you.
yeah,
Thank you very much for it.
you start, Dre, and then we'll kick it to Charisse.
Okay, got you. I thank everybody, one, for joining us. I see a couple of our other steering committee people there, Amy, and some others that joined in as well. I really was skeptical going into it, and most of us were going into it. A lot of times, when we sit at when we sit at the table, people don't understand that our experience is what really makes it. And I think, getting people to understand that being in poverty does not mean ignorance, does not mean that you have no intelligence, does not mean that you're not smart. It just means that you're in a situation at that time, as many people going through COVID-19 are starting to realize. And I think, for us, one of the biggest things that we are constantly was shifting to was being afraid of the system and not trusting it. And here it was, these were the people that were running the system that they were asking for us to sit down with them, and they were saying that they will listen to us. And that was a hard pill to swallow going in. And when the committee voted myself and Juanita to represent, and we went forward, the main thing that we said to the bigger group was, we're not going to do this work if you guys do not believe in us, and you guys understand that we are the experts at what we do, and we are the people that know what we're going through. And I think that that was getting over that trust part, because the system doesn't work for us, and we've been on this system before where we tried to do good and still were victimized, still we're looked at as criminals, still we're looked at as people that's trying to take the system, when all we need is a help up. And I think that that's where, for us, once we really got working together and we started to get into the work, they started to understand that we were real about it, and we deep dived into it, and we didn't take this on and saying that everything was going to be solved, but we took it on saying that we're going to do our part. And once we got over the trust factor of it, a lot of things moved in that direction. And as a co-chair, it was mainly making sure that we were really expressing ourselves and understanding that we were dedicated to adding to changing poverty in Washington State.
Thank you, Dre. Charisse, do you want to open? Charisse, are you there? So
Can you hear me?
we can hear you.
Okay. So for me, I was also one of those people that were very anti-trusting. I think that for a lot of us, it was generational. So it was something that was passed upon us. It wasn't anything that we wanted to see. We didn't know that we could see a bigger picture than just the day-by-day struggles, trying to keep food in your cupboards, trying to keep a roof over your head and lights on, right? Like the one thing that I appreciated though is within this smaller group, we weren't put with those that had the degrees and had all the education, because one thing that I do know is I may not have a master's, an associate, a doctorate, but I do have a doctorate when it comes to being lower income and being in poverty. And every day I am mastering and learning new ways in order to make sure that I'm looking at it from that 7 generational method, like the Native Americans look at it from, right? Like looking at how it was for my ancestors before me, how it's affecting me now, and also how it's going to affect my grandchildren, hopefully in a better, positive way in the future. The other thing that I appreciate about the steering committee is when there were things that we did not know or we didn't understand, like we understood the impact on how that law, that rule affected us, but they brought people inside the space that had that knowledge that we didn't have, so that we had a deeper and better understanding of it. Like a lot of times it was like you could feel those touches and those, like how it made you feel. But we didn't understand the why. So it was nice having people that were able to understand that part. Yeah.
Thanks, Sharice and Dre. And Sharice brought up a good point, around how these groups met. That basically the full group, of community-based organizations and agencies and racial and ethnic commissions, they met monthly for 2 years, and the steering committee met separate for a little over it's actually now going on a year, I think a year and a half. Um, and it was very intentional to not bring those groups together monthly, um, together. I mean, everyone was always welcome to come to either, but that really giving the steering committee, time to come together, really get to know get to know one another, and determine for themselves without, us in the room. I think was a powerful part of the work, but they did decide they wanted co-chairs from that group to sit on the full work group. And Drayton and his colleague Juanita were a part of that effort, and they did just a fantastic job of really holding the full group accountable. And as time went on, I think trust did build between the two groups, and we did meet a few times together, and we're hoping to continue that. It got a little stymied, obviously, in the wake of COVID, but we are trying to continue the structure for the work. So before we jump into the recommendations, I want to talk a little bit about how the group um, thought about poverty going in, and based on, what we know from existing data of the scope and the scale of the problem. And again, this is pre-COVID, so I want folks to remember that these numbers were shocking before, and they're only deepening now. So, poverty is typically measured from an economic standpoint, that if you don't have a certain amount of money or income, and you fall below a certain threshold, then you're considered living in poverty. But, over time, in, like research and also just talking to people who are experiencing poverty, we are now starting to deepen our understanding that it's much more than just a lack of income. And a group in DC called the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty presented, I think, a good initial frame to expand our thinking around what poverty means, and what success from poverty means. Like, what would it mean to be mobile from poverty? And so economic success is, of course, part of it. It's foundational, and that is how we generally think about it, but it's not enough. Equally important are power and autonomy. and having a sense of control and a say in the trajectory of your own life, and also being valued in the community that you want to be a part of, and the dignity and the feeling of just, belonging that comes with that. So, we don't have data to measure all of these things, but it is important for us to think about poverty as something bigger than just, it's not just about having money. It's really about a sense of belonging and belonging to the community that you want to be a part of and being heard and seen in that community. So that said, we do rely on existing data to give us a sense of the size and the scale of poverty in Washington state. And there's various measures that we use to tell this story. And even the ones I'm going to tell you or show you now, they tell part of the story. And I'll get to, how we, I think, build upon quantitative data to tell a better story in just a moment. But the traditional measure of poverty that we use is the federal poverty line. Um, for the purposes here, we use 200% of that measure because the poverty line just at 100% is about $21,000 a year for a family of three. There's almost nowhere in the country where a family of three could make that much money and meet basic needs. So 200% is a more realistic measure. That's about $42,000 a year for a family of three. And so that's how we measure economic hardship. And there are degrees of hardship within that, of course. But using that measure, it's about a quarter of the people in Washington state, 1.8 million, and about 500,000 children that were living below that threshold in 2018. Again, that's the most recent data that we have prior to COVID. So for a whole host of reasons, the federal poverty measure is not always the best measure of what it takes to make ends meet. And so new measures have emerged, cost of living measures that look at, what are the actual costs based on family size and geography that it takes for a family to meet basic needs, including things like healthcare and childcare and transportation, food, and but really it's just a basic set of um, things that that families need to just get by. And when we look at one of those measures, which is the ALICE measure, it stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, and Employed. That was developed by United Way. We see that 43% of households in Washington state, so almost half, are, not earning enough basically to meet their most basic needs. And then finally, we've started to look at intergenerational measures of poverty. This is a relatively new body of work, and there's various methods by which to do that. One of those methods is to look at the share of adults that are receiving public assistance today that received assistance as a child. And when we look at the data that way, we see that 46% of adults on food assistance today were receiving food assistance as a child. So we have to triangulate these measures to get a fuller picture, because if we just rely on the federal poverty measure, we're not going to get um, the full story. So while these other measures are emerging, the federal poverty measure, even with its limitations, it does allow us to dig deeper in a way that other data doesn't. And we really always want to tell a story about how things are playing out geographically, and also demographically. And so, we know from doing that, the burden of poverty is not experienced equally. If we break that 200% number down by race, by sex, by immigration status, by age, disability, I don't have rural in this presentation. We're working on a map, but you would see in rural communities, the rates of poverty are far higher than urban. Um, you can see that the burden of poverty is not experienced equally. So in our solutions, we need to look at these disparities and really work toward, what would it mean for not just to reduce poverty in the aggregate, but to reduce poverty in a way that would achieve equity for all of these groups. Sorry, there we go. And, we can look at race, ethnicity in those aggregate categories that I just showed you. But we can even dig deeper than that because we know that masks even more of the story. By looking at just these high level racial and ethnic groups, we can break down the Asian and Pacific Islander community and the Latino community. We can look at data for tribal nations, and you can see that there's significant variation, not just between race and ethnicity, but within different racial ethnic groups. And this is another part of the story that we need to understand. Most data sets don't allow us to do this. So we rely on census data because it's the most historically reliable, and it still leaves a lot out. And that brings me to this quote from Abigail Echohawk, who is the Chief Research Officer for the Seattle Indian Health Board. And she really is a pioneer around what she refers to as decolonizing data. And so this quote, when we think about data, it was never gathered to help or serve us. It was primarily done to show the deficits in our communities, to show where there are gaps. And it's always done from a deficit-based framework. What they don't talk about is the strengths of our community. Decolonizing data is about controlling our own story and making decisions based on what is best for our people. So, the spirit of this quote and the reliance on the data that we have, but really digging deeper to understand the story about poverty from the people who are experiencing it, to really get the most accurate picture of what's happening. That was very much a part of the way that we went about understanding these issues in Washington State, and more importantly, developing solutions. And, all of this inequality, there's so much we could say about this, but it just has incredibly serious consequences. In here, I'm going to focus on the economic consequences, but, just from a well-being standpoint, I mean, it's dramatic when it comes to the impact that this has on really the, collective well-being of the state. Um, Indigenous, Black, and Brown Washingtonians' incomes are 1/3 lower than the state average. We know that these disparities are growing in the wake of COVID quite dramatically. We also know that, if we were to eliminate these disparities, our gross domestic product, which is one way of measuring the strength of an economy, would grow by $38 billion annually. So again, coming to there's a social and an economic argument to be made for poverty reduction that really benefits all of us. So as I mentioned, we met for 2 years every month. The steering committee was meeting during that time as well. And 250 recommendations were created over the course of that time that, we really needed to think about how do we organize those recommendations and how are we going to prioritize what goes into this plan. And again, the steering committee was really the driving force behind how we were able to do that. And so these are the principles that emerged in that process. And I wanted to share them with you and also give Dre and Sharice an opportunity to weigh in because I think it was really important to emphasize, how we were able to narrow those 250 recommendations ultimately into 8 strategies with 56 specific recommendations across those 8 strategies. So the first one was addressing the root causes of poverty and the urgency of now. And part of that was driven by, I think a lot of people look at poverty as something that is systemically driven. And, it's really important to address those systemic changes. But the steering committee often reminded us that, while you're trying to change the system, and while that's absolutely important and necessary, we can't feed our kids tonight. And we are struggling to pay our rent this month. And that if you're not addressing the urgency of now, it's not helping us. And so focus on the systemic change, but do what you can with the system now so that we get what we need. The second principle was really elevating the expertise and the influence of people experiencing poverty in our recommendations, which we've modeled through the steering committee, and we also have recommendations to do that just at the state level, and highly recommend it as a practice at any decision-making table. The third was to achieve equity in all forms, but emphasize racial equity, as we know that people of color, communities of color, no matter what the demographic indicator you might be looking at, people of color and communities of color are likely doing worse. It's foundational and it's deeply rooted in our nation's history. And so addressing structural racism and how that plays out across many different areas of well-being was critical. Blending evidence, innovation, and collaboration. These are evidence-based recommendations, and there's no shortage of ideas, good ideas, great ideas, on how to reduce poverty and inequality. That being said, a lot of those good ideas so far have not successfully closed gaps along demographic or geographic lines. So we allowed for innovation in this work, and that was driven by the perspective of the steering committee and many of the groups that we met with over the course of the 2 years. Like, what were their ideas? What are we not doing that we should be doing? And then collaboration. There was a lot of work happening while we were doing our work. Poverty is such an umbrella for so many things. We didn't feel like we needed to recreate the wheel. We often look to other groups for, if you're doing something great that lives within these principles, then we want to bolster your work. And so we've done that in numerous places throughout the plan. And then finally, we wanted this plan to inspire hope and build on the resilience that people experiencing poverty have. So many of the existing systems we have, they instill fear in people, and they were created to do that. And we know that that is not a tactic that works. In fact, the emerging science of hope shows that hope is a key ingredient for people to be successful at moving out of poverty. And so we need our systems to inspire hope and build on all the skills and resilience that people experiencing poverty have, and not, punish them for being in the position that they're in. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Charisse and Dre to comment on, this process. And I think this time maybe Charisse will start with you if you're ready.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, for the process for us, we not like we didn't know, but it was nice to see that it wasn't defined to one county or one city, or even that it wasn't defined just on how I look like, or my race. Um, what we found was a lot of us had the same struggles, right? Some of us had a little better than some of us. It was amazing for me to see some of our parents continue to show up, knowing that once they went back home, they were dealing with a house that was still infested with mold, or that transportation had stopped working and they were still there. I think one thing I also want to touch on was a lot of us knew that this stuff was already unjust, right? I think that it's nice that, I don't want to say it's nice that COVID happened, but COVID kind of pulled back that blanket, and all those inequities have now surfaced. And instead of it just being a few of us feeling it, there's a lot more people that are speaking on it. But then the other part is with this 10-year plan, we didn't look at it as a Band-Aid, right, a temporary situation, because of the fact that it's hard for us to plan for a future when we're still trying to get by day by day. So for some people, that $1,200 wasn't, a lot. It didn't mean anything for them. But a lot of us that were those people that were pushed out of work, we were barely making it beforehand, that $1,200, that may have been lights for the remaining of the month. It also could have been your rent. I think also another thing, like when we talk about the inequities, and I know I keep going to COVID, but COVID seems like it's something that people understand in the now. Like even when schools and we had to go into this distance learning thing, just imagine you were already, if you still had a job, if you were already barely making it with spending time with your kids, being a single mom. Now I'm taxi, nurse, you know, because I'm also supporting that's the one thing I can say that I'm proud about my community being lower income. We do know how to support each other. Now I'm also taking on my sister's household. Now there may be a laptop that may have been provided, but that's one for my house of five. Now let's say whether or not I had internet service, or you even have some parents that were like, we're not going to take the laptop because in my community, for people like me, fines hold you back from graduation or to even transfer to another school. So just let that sit and marinate a little bit. So it's like you have to pick and choose whether or not I'm going to try to give my child that best in order that step up, in order to continue to learn and to grow, or am I so afraid of possibility if this gets damaged, lost, or stolen, the repercussions, and if that could be that one thing, because I don't know about you guys, I'm holding on to the hope that my daughter goes to college, but that could be that one thing that holds her back in order for that not to be her future.
Thank you, Sharice. Dre, you want to add to that?
Yeah, just what Sharice is talking about is what we fought for towards that end. And if you look at that end piece, that's to inspire hope and build on resilience. And that's what when Sharice is talking about, that's the goal that we're trying to get to. We're trying to get to that where help me to get there. You know what I'm saying? To inspire me to be more because of just the situation I'm in. And I think, you know, when you look at how everything blended in, the key things were we needed something to happen in this moment. And we're talking about, as you see with COVID, it happened right away. This was not no delayed process to get people funding. This was no delayed process or red tape to get people more food and put them on unemployment and give them, guaranteed unemployment for a while. These were things that happened immediately. And I think a lot of people took what we go through as one, our fault all the time, and two, well, you can survive it. And I think when you look at everything and how it comes across, these are the things that were important to make sure that people like us were not downgraded, but looked at as people that needed to move forward in life and become better citizens and, participate in, taxes. But I think the biggest misconception, I was talking to somebody, people think that poor people don't pay taxes. We pay taxes. We just don't have enough money to do what we need to do after paying taxes, So a lot of times it's that refund check that becomes our lifeline to pay off our back bills, and now we're back at square one again. So our understanding of how this guidelines went across hit each of those points, and to make sure that, as you see in the middle, is emphasizing that a lot of this was racially based. A lot of it, put it on Black and brown people throughout the country to say, oh, you guys are the ones that's on it, when we're sitting in a room and you see so many people that are living in poverty and struggling.
Thanks, Dre. So, with that, I'm gonna jump into the 8 strategies that the group developed, and then we're gonna spend some time walking through, the specific recommendations within each of these. And again, we won't have time to go through all of them in depth. I really encourage folks to go check out the plan at dismantlepovertyinwa.com, and that'll be up at the end of the presentation where you can look at it in detail. But we'll try to give a good overview of, some of the specifics of what made it in. And, I'll just quickly go through the 8 strategies. The first was to understand structural racism and historical trauma and take action to undo their harmful effects in state policy programs and practice. To make equal space for the power and influence of people in communities most affected by poverty and inequality in decision making. Again, that speaks to, I think, trying to institutionalize the practice of the what the steering committee did for this work, we need to be doing that across the board in so many different areas where decisions are being made for people, but without their input. Targeting equitable education, income growth, and wealth building opportunities for people with low incomes. Strengthen health supports across the lifespan to promote the intergenerational well-being of families. Address the urgent needs of people experiencing homelessness, violence, mental illness, or addiction. These four issues are the main reasons that prevent people from really finding a pathway out of poverty and to obtaining like employment or higher education. Build an integrated human service continuum of care that addresses the holistic needs of children, adults, and families. This was a big issue, probably the biggest that was addressed during the plan, and there's work being done on this now. Decriminalize poverty and reduce reliance on the child welfare, juvenile justice, and criminal justice systems. This was another huge category. These systems, are both a cause and a consequence of poverty, and they certainly deepen and exacerbate the experience of it. And then finally, ensure a just and equitable transition to the future of work. When we were doing this prior to COVID, the future of work seemed like something obviously in the future. There are things happening like automation, artificial intelligence that are beginning to eliminate lower wage jobs that people experiencing poverty are more likely to be working in. That future just accelerated a lot by COVID. And so we'll talk a little bit about recommendations from a work group that was operating alongside of us, and we wholly support their work and, rebuilding, building back from where we're at in a way that allows more people to benefit from the wealth and economic growth, as we recover from COVID. Okay. So we're going to try to go through these. I apologize if it seems quick. There's so much that went into all of these. And so we're going to, showcase them a little bit. And again, be thinking of your questions and, what's missing? What might you add? What would you strengthen? What would you say differently as we walk through them? So again, strategy 1, understanding structural racism and historical trauma and undoing their effects. There was an Office of Equity created last session heavily driven by Governor Inslee, as well as a lot of legislative support. That office exists, but it was defunded in the wake of COVID because budget changes needed to be made so the state could address the emergency response for COVID. So it lives in spirit. It's not funded in the way that we had hoped. It was initially a win. But really, we're going to continue trying to do this work and develop trainings on historical trauma, racism, implicit bias for all public employees, and also develop data processes and tools that prioritize racial equity and equity across the board in the way that we do our work at the state. The second strategy was around making equal space for people who are most affected by issues at decision-making tables. And there's numerous ways that we can do this. One idea that stemmed from a full-day meeting with Lummi Nation and with additional feedback from the urban Indian community, as well as communities of color, was to develop a formal process for truth and reconciliation. The idea behind that is we really can't heal unless we address the truth of the history that people of color and indigenous communities have experienced, and how do we learn from that and not replicate it. I think especially in recent days, for a long time, this issue is ever important, and we have a lot of work to do to heal from our past. Institutionalize the practice of including people most affected. We would really love to see a group like the steering committee established at the state level so that we can hold people accountable to having input from people most affected on these issues. investing state resources to increase the ownership capacity of communities most affected by poverty. Part of the reason that people don't sit at decision-making tables is they don't have the power or the wealth or the pathway to those tables. And so how do we build up their ownership and ability to do that on their own terms? Strategy 3, there was a lot in here. Obviously, education, income growth, and wealth building are key areas for, not just meeting basic needs, but also just being able to stay in a place where you can meet your basic needs and get ahead. So there was a report done by the Washington Roundtable and the Partnership for Learning, and it was called the Washington Kids for Washington Jobs Report. It had a lot of great recommendations in there for education. They didn't go quite far enough on achieving equity, and so we recommended adopting those recommendations, but really bolstering them with these more specific targeted strategies to make sure everybody is included in obtaining a good education. And so that included things like accelerating naturalization, eliminating harsh discipline practices, making sure that children experiencing foster care or homelessness are included, etc. So lots of ways that we could improve the education system so it's more equitable. Salary and wage transparency and fair labor practices, access to no or low cost financial resources, tax policy factored into this strategy. As Drayton said, in Washington State, low income people pay the highest share of income and taxes of any other group. It is, has a twofold effect. We tax low income people here more than any other state in the country, and we rely on them disproportionately to pay into the system that we all rely on, like education and building roads and bridges and higher ed. So we need to lower that burden for them. Modernize unions. There's a child care collaborative task force that had recommendations during this time. Wonderful recommendations to expand childcare. We know that that system is under tremendous strain in the wake of COVID. Increasing and preserving the stock of affordable housing, and providing incentives in the tax system to support equitable economic growth so more people can benefit. Pretty big category there. The fourth strategy, strengthening health supports across the lifespan to support intergenerational well-being. We have a really strong health insurance system called Apple Health in Washington, and we could expand on that, build on it to provide a supplemental benefit so the costs, out-of-pocket medical costs aren't as bad and that more people are covered. Culturally and linguistically appropriate care across the board. This highlights, women and families that are expecting, but certainly it applies to other areas like food assistance, home visiting services, access to contraception and counseling, so that people have choices and are able to plan accordingly for their families, and also in-home Medicaid funds for seniors. Seniors, their poverty rates are lower generally by their Social Security income, but not all seniors get a huge Social Security income, and our poverty rates mask other issues for them. One of which is just the cost of, aging and having, being able to stay in your home in a way that's safe. So this covered really a lot of supports that affect age groups across the lifespan. Strategy 5, to address these 4 urgent areas, that are really crises in their own right and stem from the fact that we haven't done enough to reduce poverty and inequality. And that includes things like community-led data collection to get at, understanding these issues more, rental assistance and diversion programs, emergency, transitional, and permanent supportive housing options, which we know work. We have some wonderful programs in Washington State that could be expanded and scaled. Supported education, job training, and employment, access to behavioral health services and integrating that into our education system. Those were all ideas that emerged under this strategy. And then strategy 6 on building a more integrated continuum of care. This was huge. We spent tons of time on how onerous the system is when you actually need assistance. And I think in the wake of COVID, as Charisse was saying before, this is affecting a much bigger group of people. We really need to work on providing a more seamless, integrated system. And because the steering committee, this was really something that they, drove home quite eloquently. I'm going to turn it to Charisse and Dre to cover this one. So, Dre, do you want to start?
All right, I can. I want Sharice to start on this one because it was very dear to all of us, and it was her voice and a couple of other steering committee's voices that really looked at, our children from it. So, if Sharice, if you can.
Hey, I was just here to support. One of the Supremes. You were supposed to be Diana. So I think for us, the hard thing with this is also what we discovered is being low income and having to utilize some of these services is like another full-time job. No one talks to the other agency. You have to continue to repeat your story, and depending on how traumatic that is, like let's say I now need CAS assistance because of the fact I'm trying to get out of the domestic violence situation. Just imagine how triggering that is to continue to have to keep saying this same message when a lot of times you're in this big room, there's no privacy. I may even have my child with me because of the fact that how long I have to sit there. And I know that those 3 hours that she was in Head Start program, right? Like it was unsafe for me to sit there that whole time in order to make it back to pick her up. Another thing is there's such a rush for us to get out of the system that there's really nothing put in place for us to have that long-term success. A lot of times we're penalized and we're losing services or benefits before we even get our first paycheck. Another time it's like there's not an easy transition when it goes to, I now want to go to college, but a lot of times it's a quick trade. And a lot of those trades, they're not even enough to get us out of having to use benefits. And then you have someone else telling you what they feel your future should be because of the fact that if you wanted to do something that would get you out of that continuous circle, that you need to lower down your expectations. Another thing is like getting CAS assistance, and also with the thing on it has to be part of my work plan, which for me, they don't take in your family dynamics or the issues that you're having at the time on why you may not be able to do that. So true life experiences for me was, while I was supposed to be in work stories doing my work activities, my son was also struggling with his mental health stuff. So the same work system that I went to in order to fight to have him involuntarily placed in a clinic to get his mental health stuff checked out, and I'm sorry, it's a little emotional for me still. I was penalized and was taking all of our resources away because of the fact that I was trying to do my best as a mom in order to make sure that he got his treatment that he needed. And I want to say more, but I didn't realize that was going to be triggering for me, Drayton, so I'm going to let you go.
No, thank you. You got it right to where it is, and that's the part that we realized when we went deeper into it. And Sharice brought this up early, and Lindsay as well. We really brought the experts that understood it from a system standpoint and program standpoint to make us understand why these things were there. So what we found was that there were certain policies on the state level that were fighting with federal level policies. And, those dynamics made us understand as a steering committee that, so how do we get around that? Once we got the understanding that, oh, it's that's holding you back from helping me fully. So how do we, change that dynamic in, let's say, an RCW or a WAC law in order to give that agency the access to do what they need to do to help us full turn. So like what Sharice was talking about, you had agencies that would not talk to each other behind the scenes. They knew the information, but they made us work for the information. And I constantly bring up a time that I was trying to add up my hours and getting my hours, to where it was. I put it in and I was, I guess, $3 or $4 off. But they said to me that, well, you're off, and right now, we are going to put you under a case review because the numbers did not match. And it's like, you already had the numbers. You didn't need to, look at me to answer a question. And I think it goes to that point of what we realize in our group. We're working for the system instead of the system just helping and working for it with us. And I think that's where we found, when we talk about the inspiration and hope, that there is no off ramp. It's a push, and it's just a straight drop. And when we go back to data, that's what really messed us up, because we didn't see people that were getting off of assistances because they were being successful in going into successful jobs and landing on their feet. What we saw was people getting kicked off because of frustration and because of politics and other things that was behind it. So all of this was very important to us because we needed to make sure that they understood that you guys got to work as hard as we got to work. And I tell people all the time, if you look at, I helped the guy. I'm gonna put a quick story. I helped the guy that 6 months ago he and I was in an argument about people on public assistance. And a couple of weeks ago, he came to me and he needed help to get food stamps. And the form that I saw in that food stamps form to fill it out was not the form that I filled out. And I mean, you start to realize that, we're jumping through hoops and everything to allow people to take care of their families and to live. And that's where we found, the biggest necessity of red tape was, dealing with policies and dealing with practices that are, ancient in nature, but also biased in nature as well.
Thanks, Sharice and Dre.
And I'd
So
just like to add in one more thing. As one of our steering committee members put it in a perspective where it finally made sense to me, was that we're forced to be put in this sick shoots and ladder game. So like every time we're thinking we're making advancement moves forward, here comes this another thing where the system has now made us take this giant slide back down.
yeah, thank you, Sharice, for that. There are so many great quotes that are included from the steering committee, and a lot of them stemmed from this very conversation. And Sharice is right. The chutes and ladder metaphor, I think, is one of the strongest ones that, that, and also like I feel like getting what I need is just a lucky roll of the dice. It's so inconsistent. So there were a lot of, metaphors around this that like basically it's left to chance as to whether or not you're going to be successful. And that's not something we want our system to do. So there was a lot of humility, I'd say, from the agencies and really listening and learning to the experience of people, not just navigating one system, but navigating, across the 7 or 8 agency systems that administer assistance to people with low incomes. So really powerful conversation around this one. I should mention actually that strategy number 6, there is a group that's come together that Employment Security Department is running right now and really trying to address this wholeheartedly, like how would we get this right? Because this was so important to the steering committee. This was one of the ways that we could, take advantage of, make changes now so that they can, really feel it in their lives today versus, something that is going to take much longer to solve. Strategy 7 was around reducing reliance on systems that really exacerbate the experience of poverty. This was another area that the steering committee really pushed the full work group on to get right. And I think in the beginning we knew that this was important, but what we heard from steering committee members was just, look, if you're not addressing the child welfare, juvenile justice, and criminal justice systems, like, you're going to get this wrong. And so, we learned a lot from them in their experience, and we also had a number of experts come in to inform our work. We also turned to a lot of great efforts happening, on these issues in the community, and we didn't see ourselves as, replicating that good work, but really building off of it and focusing in on, the point at which people are about to enter and also exit these systems, and how policy changes could really make it easier. So Dre, this was super important to you, and would you mind stepping in and taking this one?
Definitely. One of the things that we really found with this that was so shocking to us was a lot of people that get arrested for smaller crimes and not things that gave them long time did not get any help or any guidance. And for us, it was just a eye opener to realize why so many people become repeat offenders and then they get sentenced long term. So when we found that out by, like we said, we brought the experts in to speak to us to make us understand it better on our suggestions. This was one of the things that we just couldn't understand, because by that time that child is not that child, but the adult maybe away in prison, in short term, they're not getting anything that can make them better to come back out. So you only get that on longer term sentences. And the reason why is because they felt that why waste money on somebody that's going to get out of the system quickly, when we looked at it as we didn't understand why not take that and help that person now, so this way they don't come back. It may be just because of education. It may be because of finance. It may be because they just don't know where they want to be in life. And if we can get them on that part of it, it helps, because a lot of the children are left. And the children go through this experience with the adults. So if an adult is missing and now that child has to go to grandma or auntie for that time, there is no support for that child at all in how, the parent is being let out, or any support for that child to deal with emotional stress, or any support for that child to even understand what's going on. And we saw that connection with both of those, and how this recurring door of people going in for smaller crimes, as everybody has saw in Cairo News and all of them constantly talk about it with the homeless community. But there's no help being done for people that aren't getting these short terms. And we just felt that this was so dramatic on not just the adults, but also the children.
Thanks, Dre. Sharice, do you want to add anything to that?
I would, but there's nothing to add. He summed it up perfectly.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think if I was to add anything, it's also the youth, right? And then that perpetuating cycle. And then some of these kids who, like, if we look at the school to prison pipeline, right, and how a lot of times you're able to get in trouble just based off of hearsay. So not nothing that the school or the teachers seen themselves, but as a report that was told to them. Yeah, I think that that's another thing that also kind of plays into that.
Yeah, absolutely. There were so many heartbreaking stories about people's experiences with these three systems, and how once you become involved, it's just the amount of stigma and judgment and fighting for what somebody may need to successfully exit. The stories, and again, there's just so much more detail in the full strategic plan around why we came to these recommendations, but just another really powerful category that deserves immediate attention. And then finally, ensuring a just and equitable transition to the future of work. As I said early on, there was a future of work task force that was doing its work alongside of us. and we stayed connected to them. And we think their report, and there's a link to it in the full plan, there's a lot of great stuff in there, but it needed to be bolstered with some more intentional strategies to achieve equity. And so we included things like expanding mentorship and career-connected learning for people who are furthest away from opportunity, when we think about workforce development, and also accelerating pathways for immigrants and refugees with advanced degrees and training, so that they can become accredited here. A lot of folks come to this country with significant skill sets, but they are not able to get accreditation. A great example of that is right now when we were at a shortage of workers in the medical field to deal with COVID. A lot of immigrants and refugees with medical degrees, are not able to get accredited, and they wanted to help. So that's something that's being looked at right now. Incentivizing employers for living wage employment, economic triggers during times of recession. That's another thing we're looking at right now. We also recommended developing a pilot for portable benefits and a guaranteed basic income as something to look at for how it would work in Washington, given the anticipated disruption that things like automation and artificial intelligence are going to do to especially lower wage work. I will say that, at the time we recommended just piloting this, because, it was something that we didn't see as palatable in the near future, and we needed to learn more. In the wake of COVID, we have seen the conversation around these two things accelerate tremendously. And so a lot more people are talking about it, and a lot more people are wanting to, sooner than later, figure out how we might do this. So, um, you know, this is a lot. And we were asked by Governor Inslee to do a 10-year comprehensive plan to reduce poverty and inequality. And I think that, we were successful at doing that. Poverty is a complex issue, and the root causes of it are really, grounded in a lot of the systemic changes that we've been talking about. So we know we're not going to be able to do this all overnight. So our priorities and how we think about this in the wake of COVID, it is something that we're looking at. But no matter, COVID, these things are even more relevant than before. And so as we think about implementing over the next 10 years, we want to lay a strong foundation for this work, which I think has happened. I will say, especially, and again, this is such a testament to the steering committee, the way that the work group transformed in how they think about their work at the agency level, or, no matter the organization that they sit in, whether it was a philanthropic entity or a community-based organization, there was such a transformation in having the people who are most affected be driving this work, and just giving up our power and approaching it with humility, and letting them steer us, was so significant. And I can see that strong foundation in the conversations we're having now as we talk about economic recovery. Just the impact it had on the people in that group was amazing. Um, and we talked about over the next 10 years, we need to maximize everything about the system we have, because we can't just say, oh, this isn't working as good as we would like, so we just are going to build this new system. That's going to take time. So let's maximize everything we have and then build the system we need during that same time so we can transition, in the future. I will say, in the wake of COVID, I think we've maximized our system significantly. Things that have been on legislative agendas for 10 years since the last recession were implemented within a matter of weeks to address the crisis. So we know it's possible. The limitations of that system are showing themselves in dramatic fashion right now. And so the conversation around building the system we need, now is the time to be thinking about that. And that's part of why we really want to hear from folks like you. To do that, COVID disrupted the status quo for us. And so that, if there's a silver lining, it's to find the opportunity in the crisis to improve and build an equitable future on the other side of this. There's a lot of things we're good at. We're good at data and efficiency, continuous improvement. There's a lot of things we need to improve upon. And that is, being humble and working alongside the people that are most affected, building stronger community partnerships and collaboration, and also taking anti-race, not just caring about equity, but taking anti-racist and anti-oppressive action in our work. So speaking of COVID, this plan has become front and center in a lot of ways. We did a soft launch just prior to it hitting. We were a little worried about it falling off the radar, and happily that has not happened. Governor Inslee's recovery effort has poverty and inequality as part of his main strategy. And the three co-leads of this effort, which were Department of Social and Health Services, Commerce, and Employment Security Department. The secretaries of those three agencies are also leading the equitable economic recovery effort for the state. And just 2 weeks ago, those three secretaries, in collaboration with the 5 other agencies that administer assistance to people with low incomes, endorsed the 10-year plan as foundational for equitable recovery. So there is a lot of recognition that these issues are critically important to address as we try to get on the other side of COVID-19. So some things that have been, advanced in this time period, creating a definition of economic recovery that is based on a combination of low unemployment, low poverty, and no racial or geographic inequality. We know that typically during recessions, recovery is uneven. Some people experience that burden more than others. We're seeing that now. And we have to move beyond, typical ways of saying that we're recovered, which are, usually based on aggregate unemployment or expansion of GDP, and really embrace and hold our state accountable to a different picture moving forward, so that we have the funding and the policies and the programs in place that we need, so everybody recovers, and people who have historically been left out are included moving forward. Lots of conversation around how to make sure the steering committee and the practice of that is institutionalized as we talk about recovery from COVID. And then in thinking about, what's needed immediately, immediate investments guaranteeing food, housing, and medical needs, like the most foundational needs during this time. A lot of this has been done, and we need to continue that work. In the very near term, finding ways to provide people with unconditional cash assistance, which means not tying it to work requirements. We know that that doesn't work, and it didn't work before, and it especially doesn't work when the jobs are not there to go back to. So we need unconditional cash assistance so people can meet other needs like school supplies and toiletries and personal hygiene items, and to get cash flowing through the economy. Resources for cost of living like childcare, rent, affordable housing, etc. These are all ideas being floated around now. And then finally, we've really encouraged this long-term approach and using the 10-year plan as a foundation moving forward. And we're seeing a lot of great progress on that. So before we jump into discussion, and I know that we only have about 15 minutes left, we end on this quote from Drayton and his co-chair Juanita, because I think it's just such a great way to ground people in the task ahead of us. And I'm going to read it, but I'm going to give Sharice and Dre both a chance to just comment on what this means and what the steering committee, going back to those issues of trust and the amount of time that they put into this, and how are we going to respond? So they said that trust is something that comes hard for many of us, and a plan without action is just a plan. We wholeheartedly want to believe that the time and energy we invested in this effort will result in the policy and program changes so desperately needed for our children, families, and communities, but remain concerned that politics and privilege will trump the bold steps needed for more Washingtonians to achieve the independence, self-determination, and economic success that can be shared with our children and grandchildren. We are deeply grateful to Governor Inslee for taking a stand on poverty and inequality. For those of you with the power to now decide whether and how to act, please remember that millions of Washingtonians, just like us, will continue to struggle to keep a roof over our head, struggle to feed our children, and live without peace of mind that things will be okay. Please don't forget that we are the people behind the numbers, the lives that will benefit should you choose to act. And I think that, this, again, pre-COVID, this statement now speaks to a lot more Washingtonians than it did before. So Drayton and Sharice, I'm going to give you the final word before we move to discussion.
Thank you. Every time you read it, man, it's I love. I'll say it like this: as we were coming to the end, the fear was still there. And you're talking about a whole year of working together, whole year of, going back and forth, even sitting down, having a dinner and conversating and getting to that trust factor. The fear set in for us, very real. Is this going to happen? Are they going to do what we said? Are the things that's going to be put in there going to be pushed? Or is it going to be a paper that we produced and then it's just going to sit on the side of the desk and say it was a great job? And so many of my other members, including myself a little bit, was skeptical. And when we, to Lori's team and their camp, man, just really put together a report that when we saw it, we said, okay, our voices were heard. When they echoed back that we're going to support you, don't worry, we're not going to, let up. Because I'll be honest with you, the conversation was they all have jobs. And whether they were going to give up their jobs to fight for us and put themselves in a position is not something that we see happen at our level. Nobody does it for us. Nobody says, you know what, let me move something for you, so this way you can have it better. There's always this eye on us. So we didn't have that belief. But when we saw the report, especially in the second stage, we were very happy to know that our voices were really, really heard. And our suggestions were put into language that made it even more potent and stronger so that everybody can get it and understand it on all levels. And I think that watching the response every time that we went out and hearing how other cities and people that we have talked to was looking at this as like, wow, you guys really worked together to come up with this, was inspiring to all of us. That every time we got that back or that message back was so delightful to know that our work was not in vain and our time was not used inappropriately. And that's where this really came from, to make sure that urgency was pushed to get this done and to be brave, not that they're by themselves, but to be brave and move forward to help.
Thanks, Dre. Sharice, do you have any
Okay,
final?
so for me, my final thoughts are this. It's fear, right? Like, we were already scared before this. We're even more scared after this because of the fact that before it was a smaller percentage of us that were having to utilize those services that were already very underfunded, right? Like, when it came from manpower, like, people already being stressed out because, a lot of the jobs are highly stressful within themselves. But even another fear, now we're fearful on, like, when this is all over, and we have to pay that back rent. And be mindful, some of us are still waiting for unemployment, and that's supposed to run out with the extra money come the first. Yeah, that's another fear. Fear of, I know someone who she's so afraid of what the first is going to happen, and not just relying on the unemployment, that right now she needs to have merger surgery, and she's choosing not to because of the fact that if there's a job, she knows she needs to go out there and go get one before everyone else goes and applies for them. Another like, yeah, so my big thing is fear. But I want to end it off with this. I wholeheartedly believe and know that those that are the closest to the pain need to have seats so that we are closer to the power, because of the fact that when you guys write up things, your intent is always great, but how it impacts us is a whole nother level. And with that, I want to thank you for all that you have done thus far and whatever and all the things that you are going to do moving forward after hearing all this information.
Thank you, Sharice. So Lindsay, I'm going to turn it back to you since you've been moderating the chat. And if folks have questions, we really encourage you to use the chat in the time remaining.
Great. Well, I'll thank you again, Sharice and Drayton and Amy, for attending as part of the steering committee. And I'm just going to get going with the questions. So the first question I have, what are your ideas for increasing access to childcare for student parents and for supporting childcare in general? Would this be an expansion of programs like ECAP, Head Start, changes, expansions of the child care subsidy, or programs more targeted to college campuses?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I indicated earlier, so we followed, there's a work group that came together, the Child Care Collaborative Task Force, and they had a number of recommendations that basically cover a number of things that that your question references, like increasing the subsidy rate, for example, for childcare. I think our subsidy rate is somewhere in the 40% percentile. It needs to be 75% to sustain a high quality and affordable system. So we had a long way to go on that, but that was one of the recommendations of the task force. We need to expand our great programs of Head Start and ECAP, which is our state
LGBT community, definitely.
version of Head Start. And, then there are issues around childcare deserts, for example, that group covered. So all of those issues are covered and recommended by the group. Now, we know that the system is under tremendous strain. So there is an enormous effort with our colleagues at Department of Children, Youth, and Families to get resources from the feds and also the state to try to shore up childcare so it's there for people as they go back to work. There's so much more we could say about that, but your question there. Oh, and student parents. Sorry. Yes, there's been a lot of talk around student parents and how to provide co-locate housing and childcare for student parents so they can more easily access higher ed. There are great programs that we call out in the report, like the Jeremiah program, which houses student parents and they can live with their kids on campus. And it's a tested program, great evidence, great outcomes, and we need funding to do it. So not a shortage of good ideas, but we need to build the political will for those kinds of solutions.
And let me just say this.
And we also have to give them a livable wage, right? Because a lot of those the teachers that are in there, they don't even make enough in order to be off of systems and assistance themselves. Sorry, Drayton.
Yeah, no, it's good. So right now, there's a lot. I sit on Aspen's or Ascend program, and we're right now coming up with a lot of the back stuff to help student parents and deal with how to go forward. And that's one of the biggest things. Hold on 1 minute. Sorry, that is one of the biggest things that we're fighting for now. We're getting ready to put together a fund to go throughout the country. I'll send Lori and Lindsay the link to help that, because we found that a lot of those gaps fall in between that. And myself being a student parent, one of the hardest things that was out there was trying to not only navigate being a father, not only navigate being a student, but also navigate being on programs, which was, just in itself so hard. So I really took heart to it, to like, we have to do this, and that is coming. Aspen's Ascend does have a program, and I will make sure that the link comes out. But the full support on another level, there's so much talk around student support and child care integrated with that.
Thank you for your feedback. And again, if we don't get to your questions, we will type them up and get them out on our website. Another question is, with budget cuts looming, what programs and/or opportunities have the least cost and most benefit that can be tackled first until more funds are available?
That is a big question. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to give a complete answer because, I think so. In the Great Recession, a lot of the programs that we're talking about here were cut significantly at a time when people needed them the most. And I wasn't working at the agency at DSHS during that time, but I was, at an organization that was tracking those effects. And the advocacy community, was really fighting hard to prevent those cuts. We have a state budget that the majority of the money in our state budget is protected. Education, for example, over 50% of our budget, I think it's 55%, goes to just K through 12 education, not even higher ed or early learning, or health and human services. Those are some of the most discretionary items in the budget that are at significant risk when a downturn hits. And so I don't know if I can answer within a few minutes, like which of the programs should be prioritized over others. I do think we need to take an approach of looking at who are the people most affected, and how do we ensure that resources go to them, and try to, build people who are the worst off, start with them and then move up and do a budgeting exercise that prioritizes them. Because that way we prevent costs in the future. We didn't do that the last session, and it's not surprising that we have a homelessness crisis, a behavioral health crisis, an opioid crisis. I mean, there's a huge correlation between those things. So, more to come on that question, and would love to keep talking about it.
Great. And we will have one more question, and please know you have 2 minutes to answer this until you wrap it up. And this question is, first comment, thank you to the steering committee members for their time, expertise, and heart. I echo that. The question is, in light of the big projected state budget holes in the coming years with COVID, how critical is it that the state develop new revenue sources in order to develop and implement these strategies? There's more to it, but let's talk about revenue.
Can I say something first, real quick, Lori? I keep hearing this echo, and I'm glad that that question was asked. We cannot go back to the same way. I'll say it that way. and I really want to stress that going forward. We have an opportunity in coming into this work. I started to hear a lot from both committees, really, but mainly from the reduction work group with, how do we change it? How do we go, and make this change? And I think what COVID-19 did was give us the opportunity to start thinking about new ways. So I just wanted to, put that out there, because we do have the chance right now to, with people that are on this call and people in Lori's position and throughout state government, to implement new things that can move us forward.
Thanks, Trey. Yeah, I mean, I think that your point is a good one. We need resources to stabilize our state budget just to keep doing what we've been doing, let alone make the changes to build the system we need. And income inequality and tax policy have to be a part of that discussion. There's only a few places you can get money from. The federal stimulus is one, new revenue is another. There are certain things we can do with the budget. We have a rainy day fund that will likely be drawn down during this time. We'll decide how to spend that. That's flexible spending. So there are ways that we can approach this to maintain and build upon what we've done, but those are all policy decisions that need to occur and will be occurring. So really, we need your voice in those discussions and at the table.
All right, well, it's 2:30, Lori, so if you want to wrap up. Sorry to end it, everyone.
I know we could do this for, those questions are so good, and we do want to continue talking about them. So really encourage you, as Lindsay said, she's taking notes, she's copying your questions down. We will answer them and send them back out. We'll have additional webinars and, are just continuing this conversation. And so we'll keep building upon all these questions. There are lots of ways to tap into the work, and if you go to our website, trying to get to our last page here. There we go. If you go to our website, Dismantle Poverty and Why, you can sign up for updates, pay attention to us on Facebook and Twitter. You could be a part of the conversation there. And we would still love to hear from you. So you can email Lindsay or me. The work group and the steering committee are continuing to inform the recovery effort. So you can find out more. We're happy to answer questions you may have. So we definitely want you to connect to the work, and just really appreciate your time. And I just special shout out to Charisse and Dre for being here, and Amy, who's been on the call today. Again, if there's one thing that you can do moving forward in the organizations you're a part of, is to try to really follow the lead of the steering committee and bring more people that are most affected into your circles. So with that, we're going to call it a day, but thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.